Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here this evening and to share with you some of my understanding of my grandfather's philosophy. As you were told in the introduction, I had the opportunity to live with him for about 2 years during the last 2 years of his life, between the age of 12 and 14 of my life. And he taught me some very valuable lessons that made a very big difference in my life. Not only that, but I was privileged also because my parents believed in his philosophy and practiced it in their daily life at home as well as outside. So I have that grounding in this philosophy of nonviolence, and I try to share that with people everywhere, because much of the problem that we face today in societies, especially with crime and prejudices and hate and all of these negative things that destroys our civilization, all of that comes from our inability to deal with each other, our inability to understand each other, and basically the materialistic kind of lifestyle that we have chosen to live. Materialism, my grandfather said, has an inverse relationship with morality. When one increases, the other decreases. And we see this today, that the more materialistic any society has become, the less moral they are. And so they have to find a balance between materialism and morality. But coming to his ideas of justice, his whole concept about the justice system today, restorative justice is a very important first step in the direction of reforming and changing our whole justice system. And it does need changing, because our justice system today has come to mean punishment. And the emphasis is on punishing the person who has done something wrong and not transforming that person. And so when we look at the justice system as a means of punishing the wrong doer, we forget the problem that made that person do what he or she did, and we focus on the individual. The problem continues to fester, and by punishing the individual, we think that we have taken care of crime, and we find later on that we haven't. And we see this continuously throughout our societies everywhere, that we have to continuously increase the level of punishment. Harsher laws are required to keep people in fear of the punishment, and so they behave in a manner. But people have the tendency to get over fear. And so the crime keeps increasing, we keep increasing the level of punishment, and eventually we will reach a stage when we won't know how to deal with this whole situation. So what we need to do is to understand that justice should not mean punishment. It should mean transforming the individual. Now, my grandfather came to this conclusion through a series of injustices that he experienced. He came to England and studied law, went back as a barrister, and his first assignment that he got was to go to South Africa, to not as a lawyer, not to represent this Indian merchant, but as a translator. That is very important. He was taken to South Africa because there were two Indian merchants who had a problem, and both of them had white English advocates, and neither of them could speak to their advocates because they didn't know English. And so there was no communication between the lawyers and the client. And so the lawyers were fighting the case at their level. The clients didn't know what was going on, and the cases was just going on, and the lawyers were making a lot of money. And that's when one of them decided, let's get Gandhi to South Africa to interpret between this one client and his advocate. And when grandfather came to South Africa, within a week, what he experienced from going through the case there, that there was absolutely no case at all. It could be settled over the table in half an hour. And that's what he did. He brought both of them together and he said, "You're being taken for a ride all these months. This case has no basis at all. We can just sit across the table and settle it." And he settled the matter, and that is when he realized that what the legal system today is a war of words. We have war battlefields where we fight wars, literal wars, but the justice system also has become a war of words. And the person who can make a strong case, or who has the ability to convey his thoughts and the ability to talk, most often wins the case. And this should not happen. Justice is not about the strongest person winning the case. It's about reaching the truth. And if we don't reach the truth there, we can't really get to the bottom of the problem. He then started this whole process of changing his practice. He decided that he was not going to go in the conventional way, but he was going to get both the people together in his office and represent both of them and talk to them and settle these matters. So he became very famous in South Africa for being able to negotiate and come to an agreement and settle the problems there. But his experience also came from his personal experiences. You know, he suffered a lot of injustice himself while he was living in South Africa. He was beaten up because he was trying to travel by train in the first class, and in spite of having a first-class ticket, he was not allowed to travel there because he was a black person. And he was literally picked up and thrown off the train. And that, he thought, was the height of injustice. And when he tried to get conventional justice, everybody told him that this is the law and this is what's going to prevail in the country. And so he said, well, any justice system that tolerates this kind of injustice within them is not really worth the salt. And so it has to be transformed. He may be, in today's case, we may think that he took his experiences to another level, which we may not be able to do in a level of a society. For instance, when he was attacked by a mob in South Africa, and they wanted to lynch him. He was saved by the timely arrival of the police. And when the police arrested about 4 or 5 members of this mob and invited grandfather to come to the police station and file cases against them so that they could be tried and convicted, grandfather went to the police station. And in front of the culprits, he told the police, he says, I don't want to file case against them. I don't want them to be punished, because punishment is not going to teach them anything at all. What I want them to do is to walk out of this police station. I am forgiving them for what they have done. Let them walk out from here and think about what they did and whether they can live with that kind of hate and prejudice. And it's remarkable that nearly, I think, 3 of the 5 people became his followers. And their lives were changed. Similar thing happened with another Indian person who beat up grandfather, and he was put in the hospital because he was so badly beaten up. And the same thing, grandfather refused to file a case against him, and that person also changed and became a follower of Gandhi. So, learning to forgive and transforming people is something that the justice system today should be looking at and trying to transform. I've been doing some work in the prisons. I did it in India when I was living there, and now I'm doing it in the United States where I live. And I've been talking to the prisoners as well as the administrators, and I asked them once, I said, do you have a psychologist or a psychiatrist in the administration here at the prison? And if you do, when does that person intervene? And they told me that they do have a psychiatrist in the prison, but he intervenes only when the prisoners go crazy inside the prison. So I said, well, when they come into the prison, they've gone crazy as it is. They've done something silly in society. How much more crazy do you want them to become before you intervene there? So why not have the psychologist or the psychiatrist deal with the prisoner the moment they walk into the prison and try to help them with whatever mental difficulties they may have? But this is something that they've never thought about and never done in their whole administration there. And I'm hoping some of them have started this program, and I'm hoping that it will show a change there. But what appalled me lately, and I don't know if any of you have come across this in the news item, but about 2 weeks ago, there was an incident in the state of Louisiana where an African American person was wrongly convicted and imprisoned for nearly 23 years. And the prosecutor who was responsible for getting his conviction, he started feeling guilty about this. And it was through his intervention that the judge looked at the whole case and eventually got this person released. And the news people asked the current prosecutor who got him released, he said, are you going to give him any compensation for the 23 years that he stayed in prison for no fault of his? And he says, no, he doesn't deserve any compensation. So, he was asked, he said, 23 years of the man's life has gone down, and you say he doesn't deserve any compensation? He says, no, this is not the law, and he's not going to get anything from it. So the journalist asked the prosecutor, don't you have any compassion for this person who has spent 23 years of his life in prison? He very blatantly said, I'm not in the business of compassion. Now, if that is how we are going to look at the justice system, where there is no compassion and no concern for people's lives, then the justice system is not just at all. We need to have love and compassion as part of our whole being. And that is what I understood from my grandfather's work and his philosophy. That his philosophy of nonviolence is not just a philosophy of conflict resolution. It's a philosophy of personal transformation. He came to the conclusion that we need a lot of transformation in our lives. We need to change our way of thinking. We need to change our way of behavior. We need to change our relationships with each other. Everything is so negative today that we are always concerned about ourselves. We have become selfish. We think only of our own well-being and not about the society. Our relationships are based on how we are going to, or what we are going to get from the other person. And if we don't get anything from them, why should we bother to have a relationship? So everything about us is violent. And that's when he came up with this whole concept that the only way a person can understand the philosophy of nonviolence is by understanding violence itself. And he taught me this when I was 13 years old. And it came about through a little incident one day when I was coming back from school and I had a little pencil in my hand. It was about 3 inches long. And I thought to myself, I deserve a better pencil. This is too small for me to use. And without a second thought, I just threw the pencil away because I was so sure that grandfather would give me a new pencil when I asked him for one. But that evening when I asked him for a new pencil, instead of giving me one, he subjected me to a lot of questions. He wanted to know how the pencil became small and where did I throw it away and why did I throw it away and on and on and on. And I couldn't understand why he was making such a fuss over a little pencil until he told me to go out and look for it. And I said, you must be joking. He said, you don't expect me to look for a little pencil in the dark? He said, oh yes, I do. Here's a flashlight. And I had to go out and look for this pencil for about 2 hours. And when I finally found it and brought it to him, he said, now I want you to sit here and learn 2 very important lessons. The first lesson is that even in the making of a simple thing like a pencil, we use a lot of the world's natural resources. And when we throw them away, we are throwing away the world's natural resources, and that is violence against nature. And the second lesson is that because in an affluent society we can afford to buy all these things in bulk, we overconsume the resources of the world, and because we overconsume them, we are depriving people elsewhere of these resources, and they have to live in poverty, and that is violence against humanity. And that was the first time I realized that all of these things that we do every day, consciously and unconsciously, things that we throw away and destroy because we have so much of it, or we waste resources, all of these things that we do every day constitute violence, either against nature or against humanity. And to make me understand this lesson thoroughly, he made me draw a genealogical tree of violence. Just as we would do a family tree, with violence as the grandparent, and physical violence and passive violence as the two branches. And every day before I went to bed, I had to analyze and examine everything that I had experienced during the day and put them down on that tree. Now, physical violence is something that we understand. It's all the kinds of violence where we use physical force against one another. All the fighting and beating and kicking and rapes and murders and all of these things that happen in societies where physical force is used would go under physical violence. But passive violence is something more insidious because we sometimes don't even know we are committing violence. And yet we are hurting people. The way I had to determine whether this was passive violence or not was to ask myself the simple question, if somebody were to do this to me, would I be helped by it or would I be hurt by it? And if I came to the conclusion that it would hurt me, then that would be passive violence. And when I began to do this introspection, I was amazed that within a few months I was able to fill up a whole wall in my room with acts of passive violence. And that's when he explained to me the connection between the two. He said, we commit passive violence all the time, every day, consciously and unconsciously. And that generates anger in the victim, and the victim then resorts to physical violence to get justice. So it is passive violence that fuels the fire of physical violence. So logically, if we want to put out that fire of physical violence, we have to cut off the fuel supply. And since the fuel supply comes from each one of us, we have to become the change that we wish to see in the world. Unless we change and change our attitudes and our relationships and our behaviors, we are never going to change the world. And if we don't change the world, then we are just continuously going to go on living as we are today and creating more conflicts on the one hand and trying to solve those conflicts peacefully on the other. We can, it's something like using a crude analogy of a smoker. If a person smokes and he gets ill and goes to the doctor, and the doctor gives him medication and he feels fine and starts smoking all over again, and he goes on until the doctor finally says, if you don't stop smoking, you're never going to get better, and he dies of cancer. And that's basically what we are doing with the whole criminal justice system today. We want to continue with the culture of violence that we have created in society, continue to live in that culture of violence, and yet we want to have peace. How can we have peace and how can we have justice if we continue to foster this culture of violence? And that culture of violence has seeped very deeply into us. Every aspect of our lives has become violent. Our language is violent, our relationships are violent, our entertainment is violent, sports has become violent, everything about us has become violent. And if we have that kind of violence dominating our lives, how can we have peace? The only way we can have peace is by transforming that culture of violence into a culture of nonviolence. And a lot of people tell me that we are basically violent human beings and we can't change. And I said, we are not. If we were born violent human beings, we wouldn't need military academies and martial arts institutes to teach us how to fight and kill. We should be born with those instincts. But the fact is that we need these institutions to teach us. So it is not something that we are born with. It is something that we learn. And the way we perpetuate this is that whole concept of crime and punishment comes down to the home. When our children misbehave, we punish them. And that is the first seeds of violence that we are planting in the minds of children. Now, I said earlier that my parents believed in this philosophy and they practiced it at home. So we, my two sisters and I, when we were growing up, we were not punished when we misbehaved, and we did misbehave, believe me, we were not ideal children. My parents did penance instead. And it took the form of fasting. Depending on how serious the offense was, they would fast for a day or 2 days or 3 days. They would sit, they would feed us, they would cook the meals and see that we have eaten. They would sit at the dining table, but they wouldn't eat. And they would tell us that they are not eating because they were not good parents. They didn't teach us the right way of behavior. And because the relationship between them and us was based on mutual love and respect for each other, we felt awful when our parents had to do that. And we made sure that that didn't happen again. And that is how we need to deal with these issues, beginning right from our homes, transforming our children and using the justice system properly at home so that we can create a justice system outside in society. I'm not saying that we don't have prisons. We do need prisons. We do need to lock up some people because they have gone over the bend. But the prisons should not be places where we punish them. They should be places where we transform them. And when we have that concept of transformation, then we will be able to deal with the problems in society that cause people to commit crime instead of just keep punishing the person who commits crime and let those problems fester. If we don't deal with those problems like poverty and the disparities in income and the hundreds of things that are happening in our societies all the time that makes people commit crime. If we don't deal with those problems, we are never going to be able to put an end to crime. And crime is just going to grow and consume us one day. And we see that happening now with all the violence in society everywhere. Just now, earlier in the talk, we were talking about Scottish society, and everybody said that the Scottish society is very angry society, very violent society. And if they had guns as easily as the Americans do, there would be more murders in Scotland than in United States. I guess it would happen anywhere. The people are so angry in every country. People who are being marginalized and left behind are so angry that given the chance, they would destroy everything. So we have to look at those issues and transform our societies so that we can make a better society there. I have taken this concept of restorative justice to another level. In a Groveland prison in New York State, I've instituted a seminar between the inmates and people from society, not necessarily culprits and victims, but just anybody from society. Anybody who's willing to come and sit across the table and talk with these people. By calling them criminals, by locking them up in prisons, we have dehumanized them. And so people outside think that these people are criminals, they are not human beings, and they deserve what they are getting. So I want to break down that thing, that we have to realize that they are human beings. They did something wrong, but they should not be punished forever and mistreated forever. So when I talked with the prisoners, and I told them that we have to change, you have to change, and the society has to change, and we have to make a better society. And they asked me, he said, why do you want us to change? Because society has already condemned us. Even if we become saints, they are not going to accept us if we come out. So why should we change? If we are condemned, we might as well destroy ourselves and destroy society. I said, that's not a human way of thinking. I said, you change because you know that is the right thing to do. That is, it's through your changing that eventually we will be able to change the whole society. But if everybody says that I don't need to change and we all live as we are doing now, we are never going to make this world a better place. So these are things in the justice system that we need to look at. The dehumanization of people, the punishment, the whole concept of just punishing and lock them up and throw the keys away. All of these things have to be looked at and addressed, and we need to change our whole concept about this and focus more on the problems that make people do wrong things instead of just punishing people and locking them up. This is what my grandfather wanted through a nonviolent revolution, to transform our way of thinking, our way of living, and making this world a better place. And I think it can be done if we all decide that we want this world to be a better place. Thank you.